Welcome back, everybody. So this video is going to be a little bit long. What I'm going to do is dissect this part of your syllabus, the divisions of the cerebrum into lobes, and then those lobes, what gyri they have, or even what sulcus or salchi they have, and then I will show you at the end the insular lobe. It's going to be a very long video. I will try my best to cover it. I'll use those notes that I have as a guidance, and then I'll show you on the animation where things lie. The animation may probably not be very accurate with its salchi and gyri, but you will get an idea when you study, and you will have an idea of where everything lies, okay? So let me just make this here go into full screen, and then I'll have, yes, so the model is here. So first I would start with, okay, so the cerebrum is everything that lies above the diencephalon. So if you guys didn't know what the diencephalon is, just give me a second. So you see, that's a diencephalon, and everything above it is the cerebrum. Now that's the cerebellum. We don't want that in this video. We're gonna dive into the cerebrum. Let's see, where is it? Yes, right here. So, and just from this view, let's see if we go hide it. So yes, so that's the cerebrum. Everything here above the diencephalon found there. So everything above and going all of this part, that's the cerebrum. It's basically the coverage. That's the outer structure, okay? Let's go back. That's the brain, okay? And so it's divided into left and right hemispheres. And within those left and right hemispheres, you've got frontal lobes, parietal lobes, occipital, temporal, and then the insular at the end. Okay, so so the cerebrum is divided into the upper. It is the upper and largest part of the brain. Okay, it's divided incompletely into right and left cerebral hemispheres. Okay, so why it says incomplete is because those hemispheres are connected to each other by tracts that help the right and the left to function together. Okay, and it's divided by a longitudinal cerebral fissure. This part right here is called a fissure. Okay, so it's like a hollow tiny vertical or horizontal space. So fissures is basically things that divide things. So here, the longitudinal cerebral fissure divides the brain, the cerebrum, into the left and the right parts, okay? And so you see, that's the longitudinal cerebral fissure, okay? And you see that left and right parts of the brain, okay? And now in a bit, I'm gonna dive into those lobes and what make up those lobes, okay? So you will dive into more about the corpus callosum, and you will see the structures that are deeper found deeper within the brain. Okay, so the cerebral hemispheres, they occupy the anterior, the middle, and the upper part of the posterior cranial fossa. Okay. The anterior, middle, and the upper part of the posterior cranial fossa. Now, what is it called? The relations, okay? So you've got dura, falx, cerebri, yes. So you have, so when you hear dura matters, they are separations basically that separate the different sections of brain into different compartments, and you will study more about them, but I don't want to focus on this now. I want to dive into the most important parts. Okay, so it just tells you that the lateral part, so here lateral, okay, then we have the medial surface, which is, if I hide this, that's the medial surface, and then the inferior surface, which is on the bottom. And so if I don't hide that, that's the inferior surface of the cerebrum. Okay. Okay, let's just move forward. I want to dive into the most important things here. Okay, so lobes. That's what I want to dive into to begin with. So in the beginning, we have on each side. So if I'm going to mention something, it's present on either side. So first of all, we have the frontal lobe. Okay, that's the frontal lobe. And if I click this part as well of the brain, it's also called the frontal lobe. And everything that is highlighted here is the frontal lobe. Even if I go and say hide, this part right here is also the frontal lobe. So you have the lateral surface, superior, inferior, and the medial part of it is also the frontal lobe. And every part has different gyri, and you'll memorize all parts of those lobes. Okay, that's the frontal lobe. 1 second. Okay, and then you have the parietal lobe just behind the frontal lobe. And so just quickly to just tell you guys some important facts here. So the frontal lobe is separated from the parietal lobe by the central gyrus, okay? That separates central sulcus. And then everything that lies this sulcus is named in relation to it. So you have the post central gyrus or the pre-central gyrus. So gyrus is basically bumps. Sulcuses are the lines that you see here, the separations. Okay, so let's just dive into the general things and I'll get to those. Frontal, parietal, and then you have temporal, and then you have occipital. Okay, so occipital, parietal, temporal, frontal, and then you have the insular in the middle. So we'll have to remove those structures and it'll be deeper. I'll show you guys later, okay? All right, so let's dive into those. So you have 4 lobes: frontal, parietal, temporal, and occipital. And the sulci that are the main important ones, and they're seen here. So you have the central sulcus, okay, that separates the frontal lobe from the parietal lobe, okay. And then you have the lateral sulcus found right here. And if I go up, so central sulcus, that's the lateral sulcus, okay, that separates the temporal lobe from the above frontal and parietal lobes, okay. And then finally, that's the third main sulcus, is the parieto-occipital sulcus, which separates the parietal lobe from the occipital lobe, okay. And those are the main sulci or fissures, okay, that separate things from each other, or gyri from each other, or lobes from each other. You can read more about them, but I want to go further. Okay, now we have some boundaries, okay, for the lobes of the hemisphere. So the frontal lobe, it lies so in front of the central sulcus and above the posterior ramus of the lateral sulcus. So what does this mean is, so you have the central sulcus right here that separates the frontal lobe from the parietal lobe, and then also the lateral fissure that goes from here that separates the frontal lobe from the temporal lobe. So we're talking about mainly the frontal lobe right now. You have to know exactly what separates the frontal lobe from everything that surrounds it. So in the posterior side, central sulcus separates the frontal lobe from the parietal lobe. Then you have the lateral sulcus separating the frontal lobe from the temporal lobe. Okay, the parietal lobe, on the other hand, now it's surrounded by so many structures. Okay, not unlike the frontal lobe, because anteriorly the frontal lobe is surrounded by nothing. However, the parietal lobe is surrounded by many things. Now, anteriorly, it is bounded by the central sulcus, easy. Posteriorly, by the upper half of the line connecting the parietal occipital sulcus and the pre-occipital notch, which lies on the inferior border 3 centimeters in front of the occipital pole. So it was here actually. So you see that There isn't a clear boundary that separates the parietal lobe from the occipital lobe, and it's called the parietal occipital parietal occipital sulcus. This parietal occipital sulcus is not very clear, but they call it that, and they give you positions to know exactly what it is by two positions. So it extends from the pre-occipital notch to the parietal occipital sulcus. So that's where the parietal occipital separation lies. Okay. All right. So where did we go? Right here. So central sulcus. Yes, that's done. Okay. So posteriorly by the it is bounded posteriorly by the upper half of the line connecting the parietal occipital sulcus and the pre-occipital notch, which lies in the inferior 3 centimeters in front of the occipital bone. Okay, inferiorly. So before I move on, that's just basically an imaginary line that separates the parietal lobe from the occipital lobe. Okay, just remember it's between the parietal occipital sulcus and the pre-occipital notch. That imaginary boundary separates those two lobes from each other. Inferiorly, by the posterior ramus of the lateral sulcus and imaginary line joining the post ramus with the central line between the pre-occipital sulcus and the pre-occipital notch. So those lines or imaginary lines help us know exactly where boundaries can be of the parietal lobe or the temporal lobe, because sometimes they overlap. And so these are the boundaries of the parietal lobe. The boundaries of the temporal lobe superiorly by the posterior ramus of the lateral sulcus, easy. Okay, so it separates it from the frontal lobe, and posteriorly by the lower half of the line joining the parietal occipital sulcus and the pre-occipital notch. So the upper half is used to separate the parietal lobe from the occipital lobe, and the lower half separates the temporal lobe from the occipital lobe. Okay. The occipital lobe lies behind the imaginary line connecting the parietal occipital sulcus and the pre-occipital notch. See, so this imaginary line separates the occipital lobe from the parietal lobe. Okay. Salchi and gyri of the cerebral hemisphere. So this is where we need to memorize stuff. So this is an image that can help us know in general what the gyri of the brain are, and the salchi that form those different lobes of the brain. So just so we give a general introduction, the surface of the hemispheres is formed by gray matter and called the cerebral cortex. So the cortex is basically gray matter, okay? And deeper to that will be the white matter, okay? Each surface is divided, okay, by salci, which are the grooves found here, the lines, and the gyri, the convolutions, or the bulging areas of the brain. So these are the gyri. These infoldings result in marked increased surface area. So the whole point of those things is to increase the surface area of the cerebral cortex without increasing the size of the cerebral hemispheres. So it is bound within our skull, and so it increases that surface area without taking a lot of space. Okay, so the salcis and gyri of all of those lobes have to be memorized in a very specific manner, and you have to be very crisp clear on them, because it is hard to figure out if you're following many resources. And thank God, here in those notes, it's written by a PhD anatomy professor, and I think it's very good to trust it. And that's what I did, at least, and I was safe within my exams. So, okay, the salci of the frontal lobe. First and foremost, we want to know the pre-central sulcus. The pre-central sulcus. So remember, when we talk about the central sulcus or central gyrus, there will always be pre-central sulcus or pre-central gyrus, or you will also have the post part, which is the post-central gyrus or the post-central sulcus, for example. Okay, now we're going to talk about the sulcus. So the central sulcus. So we will mention the precentral sulcus here because we're talking about the frontal lobe. So this is the central sulcus. Okay, posterior, like pre to that. So before I go to it from the frontal part, before I reach it, I'm gonna have the precentral gyrus. And before the precentral gyrus, I'll have the precentral sulcus, of course. So precentral sulcus, precentral gyrus, central sulcus. And then after that, I have the post-central gyrus. I'll come to that later, and then post-central sulcus. So that's just introduction. Now we're talking about the frontal lobe, everything in front of the central sulcus, everything. Okay, so from this point, central sulcus, and going down and up this way. So that's this part now I'm referring to is the lateral part of the frontal lobe. Okay, and I'll get to the medial end soon. Okay, so important sulci within the frontal lobe: precentral sulcus. That one, precentral sulcus. Okay, here lies nearly parallel to the central sulcus and about one finger's breadth in front of it. It is usually divided into two parts, upper and lower. Okay. Now, the next important sulcus that we have to mention is the superior frontal sulcus, right here. So superior frontal sulcus that separates the superior frontal gyrus from the middle frontal gyrus. Okay, here begins at the upper part of the precentral sulcus and runs forward nearly parallel to the superior border of the hemisphere, right here, there. Okay. The next important sulcus is the inferior frontal sulcus. Inferior frontal sulcus that divides and separates the inferior frontal gyrus from the middle frontal gyrus, and begins at the lower part of the precentral sulcus, runs forward and downwards below the superior frontal sulcus. Okay, right here, inferior frontal sulcus. So we have, now we're going to dive into gyri. But remember, most important ones: precentral sulcus, superior frontal sulcus, inferior frontal sulcus. Okay, the important gyri, of course, precentral gyrus, superior frontal gyrus, middle frontal gyrus, and inferior frontal gyrus. Okay. And of course, all those things are on the lateral side or lateral surface of the frontal lobe. Okay, so the precentral gyrus lies between the central sulcus and the precentral sulcus. So here, central sulcus, precentral. Sorry. Here, the precentral gyrus. Yes. So precentral gyrus, like here, lies between the precentral sulcus and the central sulcus. Okay. Next is the superior frontal gyrus, lies above the superior frontal sulcus. Superior frontal sulcus extends from the precentral sulcus, and so we see that it is below the superior frontal gyrus. So the superior frontal gyrus is above the superior frontal sulcus. Okay. And then we have the middle frontal gyrus, lies between the superior frontal sulcus and the inferior frontal sulcus. Easy. The inferior frontal gyrus lies below the inferior frontal sulcus. Okay, these are the important gyri of the frontal lobe. There are more of those important ones, such as the divisions into which the inferior frontal gyrus, what's the stuff that are contained within it. Here we can see that we have pars orbicularis, pars triangularis, and pars orbitalis, and then you have on the inferior surface of the frontal lobe, we have the olfactory gyrus, and on the medial aspect now we're going to see what's happening. But we are only discussing here, remember, the lateral surface of the frontal lobe, okay? Lateral surface of the frontal lobe. Whatever you see here, we have discussed so far, and these are the important ones. I think if you stick to the important ones, you're safe to go. Now, on the lateral aspect of the brain, we're gonna dive into the parietal lobe. The parietal lobe, as we have remembered, remember that it lies posterior to the frontal lobe, posterior to the central sulcus, okay? And so posterior to the central sulcus lies the parietal lobe. And the first thing that meets us in the parietal lobe, posterior to the central sulcus, okay? First thing that meets us in the parietal lobe, right here, in the parietal lobe is the post-central gyrus. So we have the central sulcus, and then the first thing that meets us in the parietal lobe is the post-central gyrus. So when I say post, which means after, okay, after the central sulcus, post-central sulcus, after the central sulcus. We have the post-central sulcus. That's the important sulci. Okay, post-central sulcus. We have central sulcus, post-central gyrus, post-central sulcus. So it runs nearly parallel to the central sulcus and about 1 finger breadth behind that. It may be formed of 2 parts, the upper and the lower. Okay, where the sulcus that I was talking about is here, post-central sulcus. Okay, post-central sulcus and central sulcus have between them the post-central gyrus. Next, we have the intraparietal sulcus. Okay, runs backwards like an arch, beginning at the post-central sulcus and passes parallel to the superior border towards the occipital lobe. Here, post-central sulcus is here. Okay, my brain runs slow, man. It's a lot of different things. So yeah, intraparietal sulcus right here. So you see it, intraparietal sulcus. It runs from the posterior central sulcus and goes posteriorly. Okay. And passes parallel to the superior border towards the occipital lobe. Of course, it runs here and then goes towards the occipital lobe. Okay, that's the intraparietal sulcus. That's the second important sulcus of the parietal lobe. Okay, now we're going to dive into the gyri found on the lateral aspect of the parietal lobe. So the important ones here, they might be a lot, but with repetition, everything is easy. Okay, the parietal lobe is divided into 1 main gyrus, 2 lobules, and 2 small gyri. The post-central gyrus is the main gyrus and lies between the central sulcus and the posterior central sulcus. Right here, that's the post-central gyrus. Okay, the superior parietal lobe, a small part lying above the intraparietal sulcus, superior parietal lobe, right here, superior parietal lobe. Okay, lies above the intraparietal sulcus, and then we have, of course, because we have the superior, we have the infraparietal lobe. Okay. Post-central gyrus, superior parietal lobule, inferior parietal lobule, and then we have the supramarginal gyrus and the angular gyrus. Second, supramarginal gyrus and the inferior marginal gyrus. Here, supramarginal gyrus and the angular gyrus. So the inferior parietal lobe is basically divided into those 2 gyrus, the superior gyrus and the angular gyrus. Okay, so again, posterior central gyrus, superior, and then we have 2 lobules, superior parietal lobule, inferior parietal lobule, and the inferior parietal lobule is divided into the superior gyrus and the angular gyrus. Okay, and then finally, yes, so we're done. So these are the 5 main gyri. Okay, I think so. Yes, of the parietal lobe. Again, we have the posterior central gyrus, and then we have 2 lobules, the superior parietal lobule, the inferior parietal lobule. And the inferior parietal lobule is divided into 2, the supramarginal gyrus and the angular gyrus. Okay, so this is the parietal. Now we're going to go into the temporal lobe. Okay, just give me a second. I'm going to plug my laptop. Okay. Now for the temporal lobe. The temporal lobe, which is basically this part right here. That's the temporal lobe. The temporal lobe, sulci, is made up of the superior temporal sulcus and the middle temporal sulcus. Okay, so begins near the temporal pole and runs backwards parallel to the posterior ramus of the lateral sulcus and about 1 finger breadth below it, ends by turning upwards in the parietal lobe where it is surrounded by the angular gyrus. Okay, so the temporal sulcus, the superior temporal sulcus, begins at the temporal lobe of the temporal pole of the temporal lobe, goes backwards and ends at the angular gyrus. And then we have the middle temporal sulcus that separates the middle temporal gyrus from the inferior temporal gyrus. And so this is our next topic. So we have, remember, superior temporal sulcus and the middle temporal sulcus. The gyri of the temporal lobe is the superior temporal gyrus, the middle temporal gyrus, and the inferior temporal gyrus. So the superior temporal gyrus lies between the posterior ramus of the lateral sulcus and the superior temporal sulcus. Okay, look, the temporal gyrus here lies between the lateral cerebral fissure or lateral cerebral sulcus and the superior temporal sulcus. And then we go to the middle temporal gyrus, which lies between the superior temporal sulcus and the middle temporal sulcus. And finally, the inferior temporal gyrus lies below the middle temporal sulcus. Okay, all of them mentioned right here. And then finally, not finally, but the final main lobe is the occipital lobe. It's the main part of the occipital lobe, lies on the medial surface. Only a small part appears on the lateral and presents one sulcus called the transverse occipital sulcus. Okay, right here. So you have the yes, the transverse occipital sulcus, which is this one. Sorry, this part right here, transverse occipital sulcus. Okay, and you have things like the lateral occipital sulcus and the lunate sulcus, and you will see within different sources you'll come across those names. Then we have the insula. Okay, the insula is found to be the deepest. I don't know how I can show you guys this, but I guess we have to open this lateral end. So if I want to hide this, how can I just, okay, let's see if I can search for it, insula. It's not there, so let's see. So, no, not this, and big, probably. How can I show you this? Basically, what we have to do is basically open this part up, and then you will see the insula lying with it. So let me show you. I go there, and I go insula. There, you see. So if I open up, I take that lateral fissure and open it up, I will see the insula. Okay, so that's just to give you guys an idea. So the insula it is a part of the cerebral cortex which is hidden in the bottom of the lateral sulcus and appears when the lips of that sulcus is separated. Shape, it is conical mass having a base and an apex. The base is surrounded by the circular sulcus of the insula. The apex is called lumen insulae and is directed downwards. And so you have to know the parts of the insula. There are parts of the insula or the gyri of the insula. It's not mentioned right here, but if I say insula gyri, right? If I say gyri, insula. Yes, so you see, you have the three gyri, the anterior, middle, and posterior short insular gyri, separated by the anterior and the precentral insular sulcus. So these are the ones that you have to know for the insula. Okay. Okay. Now we're going to talk about the sulci and gyri of the inferior surface of the cerebrum. Okay. Now we're going to talk about this part of the brain. So if I go brain, so we're going to discuss here mainly. Okay. So the anterior 1/3 of the inferior surface is called the orbital surface, which represents the inferior surface of the frontal lobe and rests on the orbital plate of the frontal bone. That's in the anterior cranial fossa. Okay. The posterior 2/3 of the inferior is called the tentorial surface. Represents the inferior surface of the temporal and occipital lobes. The tentorial surface partly rests on the upper surface of the tentorium cerebelli. So this is another part of the dura mater that separates compartments of the brain into different structures. So when you study the dura mater, you will study the falx cerebri, falx cerebri, falx cerebelli, and then you have tentorium cellae and tentorium cerebelli, I think. Okay, sulci gyri of the orbital surface, you have olfactory sulcus. Right here, that's the olfactory sulcus, a straight deep sulcus which lies near the medial border and nearly parallel to it. It lodges the olfactory bulb and tract. Okay, you'll see that the olfactory bulb lies here. The olfactory bulb is part of the way where the olfactory nerve passes through to reach the deeper, higher controlling surface, controlling structures of your brain that helps you sense smell. Okay, so olfactory sulcus is part of there. Gyrus rectus right here lies medial to the olfactory sulcus. The remaining part of the orbital surface is divided into anterior, posterior, medial, and lateral gyri by H-shaped orbital sulci here. Anterior, posterior, lateral, medial. Okay, that's the inferior surface. And then you have the medial and the tentorial surface. So important. So the medial surface that we are talking about here is if I go touch this, hide here, that's what we're talking about. That's the medial surface. And they have very important gyri that we are going to discuss. Okay, so important sulci, the callosal and hippocampal sulci. Okay, so you have the callosal sulcus, which is this one right here, callosal sulcus. The callosal sulcus is an arched sulcus which lies just above the corpus callosum. That's the corpus callosum. Okay, the corpus callosum is basically one of the largest positions of the brain where large tracts connect the left hemisphere to the right hemisphere. So this corpus callosum allows those tracts to pass from the left and right where they connect left and right hemispheres. So above the corpus callosum lies the callosal sulcus. Begins below the rostrum of the corpus callosum. Rostrum, which is just the most not the most anterior, but it's found in the anterior part of the corpus callosum, rostrum. It starts from here. That tells you that the callosal sulcus starts from here, forms an arch over its genu. That's the genu of the corpus callosum, and body then bends around its splenium, okay, to become continuous with the hippocampal sulcus right here. That's the hippocampal sulcus. So that's the path of the callosal sulcus. Hippocampal sulcus, right here, hippocampal sulcus, seems to be the continuation of the callosal sulcus, passes forward to the splenium of the corpus callosum, splenium, right, the corpus callosum, to end and bend between the uncus and the hippocampal gyrus. Uncus and the hippocampal gyrus. Cingulate sulcus. Cingulate sulcus. Yes, right here. That's the one. Cingulate sulcus, an arched sulcus lying about 1 finger's breadth above the callosal sulcus and parallel to it. It ends and a little behind the upper end of the central sulcus by dividing into 2 branches, the marginal sulcus and the subparietal sulcus. See, so it goes and then divides into marginal sulcus and the subparietal sulcus. And then we have the calcarine sulcus. Where's it? Yeah, it's probably here. Calcarine sulcus. It is deep arching sulcus having 2 parts, anterior and posterior, which meet each other around at a right angle. Let me see. Yes, anterior part, the precalcarine, and the posterior part, postcalcarine. So here, posterior calcarine and the precalcarine. So that's the calcarine sulcus. And then you have the parietal occipital sulcus, okay? The sulcus that is found between the parietal lobe and the occipital lobe, parietal occipital sulcus. And then you have collateral sulcus, which is right here, okay? It begins in temporal lobe and extends backwards and parallel to the calcarine sulcus and lateral to it till it reaches the medial surface of the occipital lobe. Okay, collateral sulcus. Sorry, inferior temporal sulcus. It is an irregular interruption sulcus lying on the tentorial surface lateral to and parallel with the collateral sulcus. That's a lot of sulci actually, but yes, it's all of them are important, and these are the main gyri that we're going to be diving into right now. You have the most anteriorly, so when you talk about different lobes, you have to remember the medial gyres that lie within each lobe. So in the frontal lobe, medially, so now we're looking, just to remind you, we're looking here, okay? We're looking at this surface right here, this surface. But let's just do it on the other side so that you guys don't get confused. So that's what we're looking at. That's the brain. That's what we're looking at. Here you have the medial frontal gyrus until the central sulcus here. Okay, that's the central sulcus right here, or this one. So everything here is the medial frontal gyrus. Then we have the paracentral lobule, which is probably this one, paracentral lobule. Then we have the precuneus, somewhere here, and then we have the cuneus. Precuneus and then the cuneus. So just give me a second. Where did it go? Here. So we have the medial frontal gyrus, lies on the medial surface above the cingulate gyrus and in front of the paracentral lobule, forms the medial surface of the superior frontal gyrus. Okay. Just want to make sure that you guys know exactly where things are. So, okay. Cingulate gyrus. Cingulate gyrus. Okay, found above the corpus callosum. Okay. Then we have the hippocampal gyrus and uncus. That's the hippocampal gyrus, and that's the uncus. That's the cingulate gyrus. That's the medial frontal gyrus, the paracentral lobule, the precuneus, and the cuneus. And then we have the lingual gyrus here, fusiform gyrus, the inferior temporal gyrus. All of them important ones. So yes, cingulate gyrus, hippocampal gyrus, medial gyrus, cuneus, precuneus, and then you have the paracentral lobule, the lingual gyrus, the fusiform gyrus, and the inferior temporal gyrus. I think there are 9. Yes. So these are all of the ones that are found on the medial aspect. You can pause and read for yourself. Make sure, if you're looking at a very trusted source, to know the boundaries exactly where they lie. It's very important for your studying. So let me just also hide those structures probably, because when you're looking at this, you need to remove also this so that you can see the hippocampal gyrus right here, for example. And as of this, I can see the cingulate gyrus right here. I can see the medial frontal gyrus, the paracentral gyrus, the precuneus, and the cuneus. And then we have lingual gyrus somewhere here. But then all of those are just here, all of those structures here are just the structures like the ventricular system of the brain, the limbic system, and the basal ganglia. So these are the cerebellum as well. So if you remove this as well, you will see the naked structure of the brain, or the medial aspect of it, just like you see here. Just like you see here. Okay. And then finally, we dive into the functional areas of the brain, but this is not for this video. However, I hope I have tried to cover the gyri and the sulci of the brain. All of those notes are very useful, and if you read them and understand them and try to go through them a couple of times, it'll be good for you. Just wanted to give you guys a head start of where things are, what is involved, and I hope it helps to help you get your mind around it. Okay, thank you guys for joining on this video. See you guys in the next one.